I am David Slavkin, an interviewer for the Holocaust Oral History Project of the Orange County Anti-Defamation League. Today, April 9th, 1995, we are interviewing Marietta Den Berg, a survivor of the Holocaust. Thank you very much for giving testimony, a very precious gift to all of us and future generations. Will you please tell us your full name?
My full name is Marietta Simone Den Berg.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Holland, Amsterdam, May 10, 1937.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have a twin brother who is 2 minutes older than myself, and I have two half-brothers who are respectively 17 and 19 years older than myself from my father's first marriage.
And what are their names?
The names are Max and Dickie.
And your parents' names and occupations?
My father was David Den Berg, and he was the president of the Dutch theater. It isn't a corporation, it's the body that governs film theaters. And my mother was in the same business. She had her own distribution company of films, and her name is Heintje Broekman. And for both my parents, this was their second marriage. They were both divorced.
Tell me what life was like as a child in your family.
I come from a rather well-to-do family, from a Dutch merchant family, and we were very well off. I was born under rather bad circumstances because I wasn't supposed to live, but I did. I started my life out 2 months in an incubator. And we had a nurse, my brother and I. My mother got very sick. And of what I remember, it was very pleasant. We lived in a beautiful villa in a place called Barn. And like I say, we had a nurse, my brother and I had a nurse, and we had a gardener and we had a maid. So like I say, we came from a rather affluent family before the war.
Were there any other family members living with you or nearby?
Not nearby. I think the rest of my family lived in Amsterdam. My mother had 3 sisters. All of them married, and my father was quite a bit older than my mother, and my grandparents on my father's side, his parents had already passed away when I was born. My grandparents on my mother's side were quite aged, and so we don't have too much contact with the family.
Can you tell me any memories you have of Jewish life as a child?
I really don't have any, because I know that my parents did not follow Jewish customs. We didn't go to the synagogue or anything. We were more Jewish in name than anything else.
Did you notice any anti-Semitism? Did people know you were Jewish and treat you any differently that you ever recognized? Not until I went into hiding. It was then that, things became quite different. My life was quite sheltered. My parents were very careful, especially when the war started. And we were very guarded and very, well taken care of. My parents never would allow us to go out by ourselves, or we were too small too, because when the war started I was only 3 years old, so you never let a 3-year-old wander off by himself anyway. And between 3 and 5 we moved. I didn't stay in Barn. When the war started, which was on my 3rd birthday, May 10, 1940, we lived in Barn, and we had to evacuate immediately because we were living so close to the border. And I don't know whether we went back. I think we went back to the house, and then we moved to Amsterdam afterwards. We didn't, however, live in the Jewish quarter, what they called it the Judenviertel. And I remember we lived in an area that was not part of it. So somehow we managed to stay out of that.
What do you remember after that? What was life like for you?
It was different than it was in Barn. And I remember one time I'm now talking after 1940, okay, when the war had started, because I don't have too many memories from before. Between 0 and 3, how many memories do you have? But what I remember one time, the Germans were looking for my oldest half-brother's girlfriend, and we were having a razzia in our apartment, and it was terribly scary. My father had put both of us in bed, my brother and myself, and we were supposedly having scarlet fever. So, the Germans couldn't talk to us. And I remember the tension. I mean, everybody was so nervous. And I still have a picture, and I don't know where I have it, from my brother and myself as a baby, and my brother's girlfriend. Her picture, we were leaning against her because we were so little, and her picture had been cut out of it. So yeah, that is one of the real first memories I have of the occupation, where I had an immediate contact with the future, so to speak.
Were you told anything about what was going on? Was there any knowledge or understanding of what was happening?
No. I knew that everybody, children are very perceptive, even if you don't tell them anything. And although my parents tried to make it sort of a game, it's the tension, and I was just plain scared and very, very nervous. I remember that.
What would be the next event that you'd remember after that?
Well, the next event that I remember was that in connection with the Germans, there were no other events in between the moment that we were taken away from my parents and what happened. It happened from one day to the next. Apparently my parents had received a summons to report to the railway station. My grandparents, my aunts, my parents, the whole family. And they decided not to. And my father happened to know this gentleman. His name was Joop Wortman. And he was he managed a film theater. And my father knew that he was involved in rescuing children mostly younger than myself. He was involved in the rescuing the kids from the crash in Amsterdam. But anyway, because of my parents' connection, they managed to take care of both my brother and myself. And like I say, from one day to the next, I was told that I was going to go on a vacation without my parents. I was 5 years old at the time. And I was taken to the railway station with my little suitcase and a few belongings. And my mother said farewell to me and my brother. And we went with Uncle Joop. It's either Uncle Joop or Uncle Jaap, I don't remember. And we went on the train, and that was the last I saw of my parents for about 3 years.
And where and how did you live over the next 3 years?
I was taken to, my brother and myself, we were taken to a little place in the south of Limburg called Brunssum. And we were both hidden with separate families because the people from the underground figured that it was too dangerous to keep us together. And he himself was eventually moved to another family in the northeast part. And I myself was moved twice. And then I finally stayed with my last family.
Did you know where each other were at the time?
No. I didn't know where my parents were. I didn't know where my brother was. I only saw him once, and that was quite accidental, and that was the cause of my first move. And my parents, I had no idea where they were. And so I didn't really lose my identity. I don't look Jewish, so I could keep my own name and my own last name, which could be both Jewish or Christian. But I had to change the story of how I came to live with the people that I did. I no longer had any parents, and I came from another city, Rotterdam, and I was supposed to have been bombed out during the raid on Rotterdam and be an orphan. And that was to be my story.
Do you remember any other events or feelings that you had while living with these other families?
Oh, yeah.
And how you were treated?
Lots of them. My first family...
And do you remember their names specifically?
De Vlieger, the family De Vlieger. They were in Brunssum. Both my brother and I eventually ended up in Brunssum. And my memory of the time is not very good because, when you're a child, 5 years old, between 5 and 6, you really have no concept of time. But I was told that I stayed with them for about 9 months.
Do you know how to spell their name?
Yeah, it's Devlieger. And the reason why they were chosen for me was because they had a daughter who was a few years older than myself, an only child, and she happened to have red hair. So in that family, I passed for their cousin. And I was truly, I know that I was terribly traumatized because I realized after a couple of weeks that I was not going home. And I didn't understand why I had to stay. And I have to say that Betsy was her name. Betsy and I didn't get along that well. Being an only child. And I was pretty spoiled, being an only child, an only girl in a family of nothing but boys. And so it worked out okay, but I had nightmares, and I started bedwetting, and I just didn't understand the whole situation. It was really bad. And it couldn't be explained, and the family. I could feel in the mother a lot of fear. She was always fearful that she would be discovered. There was a National Socialist family living in the same street. And those were the Dutch people who had a connection with the Germans. So she was always afraid that they were going to give them away. And of course the consequences for the families hiding the children was terrible because they themselves would be taken away.
What would happen to them and the children in an event like that?
They would all be put, first of all, in a pre-concentration camp, and then they would all go to a concentration camp. And I myself, if I had been found, I would have been exterminated. because I was too young to be of any use to the Germans, couldn't work. They would have to take care of me, and that was not their aim. So
you were approximately 9 months?
I was there approximately 9 months, yeah. And then what happened, apparently, accidentally, the two families, my brother's family, and they met in the street, and I saw my brother, and I said, "Oh, that's my brother," and I ran over to give him a hug, and and my poor foster mother freaked out and got so scared, and she figured she didn't want to do this anymore. So my brother was also transferred to another family in the province of, I think it's Overijssel, Hengelo, northeast. And that's how we really got separated. It was too dangerous to keep us in the same place. We might run into each other again because it wasn't a huge town. So then one evening, one of the underground people came, and my things were packed, and I just said goodbye and went on the back of a bicycle, and we drove somewhere else.
Did you know who this person was, or another name?
No. I found out later that his name was Koen Pastoor, and he, unfortunately, when we had the reunion in 1989, I never met him. So, and I don't know if he's still alive or not, because that's 6 years ago. And he took me to a family, and they knew that they couldn't keep me. I was sort of in transition. They didn't know what to do with me. Because what happened there was they had like a shelter in it. It was like a farm with a shelter in a meadow, and they how shall I say that? It was like a transit station for Jews who had been rescued. So they were taken to the shelter in the meadow, and then so they were either picked up or they were told they had to go themselves. Usually they had somebody with them if they had to be transferred from one address to another. So here I was. People didn't know what to do with me. I was too young to understand. And I think I actually made quite a nuisance of myself. I was only 6 years old. I was very curious. I was rather unsettled, and so I wasn't the best behaved child. And I think actually what happened was I was playing outside, and one of the children in the neighborhood told me that I wasn't going to stay there. One of the kids, can you imagine? So I didn't understand that at all. Anyway, I like I say, I didn't stay there for longer than 6 weeks. And one thing I very well remember is that one day I was not allowed to go outside and play, and I was not happy at all.
Was it just one day, or from that day forward?
No, just one day. I was just, but I don't know why I remember it, but it must have been a rather traumatic situation, because I just tried everything to get out of that house and outside and see what was happening. And, I was a danger to these people because I just didn't understand, and I was curious. I wanted to know what was going on. And so I think one of the people there had connections with the school, and then this lady who was a school teacher her family, which lived just down the hill, agreed to take me. And that was finally my third family, and that is with whom I stayed.
And their names were?
And the names was the family Soons. That is spelled S-O-O-N-S. And that was in Merkelbeek. I had been moved from Brunssum to Merkelbeek.
And what was life like there?
It was nice. They were all grown-ups in the in the household, and I think by that time I had sort of adjusted to the fact that I didn't know when I was going to see my family, and I was just really trying to swing with the punches, and so they had. I think the youngest children they had were in their early 20s. They had 4 girls and 2 boys, and 2 of the, actually young women I should say, took care of me. And the parents seemed very old. I remember them sitting next to a stove, and most of the time really not moving very much. And the life, they were not really farmers, but they had fields. Actually, the father was a contractor, what you would call a contractor here. But they had sort of seen things happening, so they had converted things into, we had a cow and we had pigs and chickens and cats, and they had fields, and I think they had orchards. We had fruits. So on the physical level, I didn't suffer. I was well taken care of. But there's still the fact that you always have to be scared. You never know. You're just not you, and there are people you're not supposed to talk to, and there are even kids you're not supposed to talk to, because they don't belong to the right families, and they might say something to their parents that could give you away. And so there's always this restriction and this fear, and they were very kind to me.
Had your story changed with each family as to who you were and who you had to be, or were you able to maintain at least?
No, fortunately not. Well, with my first family, of course, I was a cousin, so that was one story. But when that was no longer there, then I was the orphan who came to stay with the family in Brunssum, yeah.
Did you have any forms of identification whatsoever?
No, not that I know of. I think I was just at the age where I should have started wearing a star, but I can't remember ever having worn it, because I think I was already taken away.
Had you seen other folks wearing the star?
I don't remember, no. And
were there any other anti-Semitic or other laws or rules or things that were imposed that you did see, that you remember?
No. Living in a small village that I did, I didn't really see any of it, which was really nice, and and because I was as fair as I am, people sort of suspected things, but they never really bothered me, and I think I know only of one time that somebody asked if I was Jewish, and I said, well, have you ever seen a red-haired Jew? I mean, the stereotype is like, let's say, Anne Frank, dark-haired, olive complexion, dark eyes. So there was the suspicion, but So I was pretty much allowed to lead an almost normal life. But, they were very strict when I had to be home and with whom I could play and what I, and when you see a certain person like our mayor, he was also a National Socialist. And if I saw the mayor like way in the distance, I had to come running in.
What was his name?
I don't remember. No, I really wouldn't know. And basically, I had a lot of freedom. Yeah.
Were you in school yet?
No. I started school in 1945, I think, actually 1944, 1945, just before the war ended. And in school, too, I was allowed to... of course, this is what I have to say. In a way, it was wonderful, and in a way, it was also very restrictive. I had to be a Catholic, of course, and this family, and I always thought it was very funny. They always impressed on me that they were Roman Catholic, and I thought it must have been a better Catholicism than just Catholic. Roman Catholic must be the best. And we used to go to Mass, morning Mass, I don't know, I think that's what you call it, every day. And on Sunday we went to Mass and to Vespers. So they were a very religious family. And I remember that the first book I ever read, when I started to read and could read, was the picture book about Jesus' life, which very much impressed me.
What happened next? You were there for about 3 years?
I was there for about 3 years. When I came, actually, I was sick quite often. I think it was winter, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't know. See, my knowledge of and time frame is very, very vague. So I was indoors quite a bit. Oh, I had to share a bed with one of the women because you could not have your own room. That just didn't exist. And in the winter, it was just terrible because we didn't have running water. So they had rainwater that they got from like one of those wooden barrels outside, and so if you had to get up in the morning, your wash water was frozen, and that was. And the food, like I say, I was not, I physically, I was not deprived. I was truly very fortunate. And in the morning, we always had these big slices of homemade bread. And they had bacon, which they didn't fry. So I had to eat raw bacon and bread. And until this day, I do not like raw bacon. It's, pork. Oof. Anyway, and they were quite kind. They were very kind to me. And we had, and I remember we had, our feast day for children is St. Nicholas. And that is celebrated on the evening of the 5th of December. And then on the 6th in the morning, you get your presents. And they really went out of their way to really do it good for me. So they, what they did was in the evening, of course they didn't have anybody dressed up as St. Nicholas, but they had somebody really stomp up the stairs and, go ho, ho, ho. And it was just, I was so scared. But then the following morning, they had wonderful presents. But I also remember that we were very close to the German border, and we never knew whether there was going to be a, whether they were, okay, let me retrace that. I'm sort of like not putting mouth and head in gear. We often had the alleys, the English fly over on their way to bomb Germany, and so we had a shelter in the house, which was a converted basement, and they had put wooden. I think they sawed off some trees or something to really give it support. So whenever the sirens went, we had to just zip down to the basement, and I think I wasn't really scared, and yet I was, And then one of the women always said, "Oh, come on, let's go hang out of the window and see planes fly over." It was, and everybody was always yelling at the bottom of the stairs, like, "You guys, come down. You can't do this. What if they're gonna bomb us? Come down." But that wasn't really funny. That was very, very scary. And I remember one time we had a razzia from the Germans, a German razzia. They were looking for the two men. One of them worked in the mines, and the other one, I think, was an engineer. One of them was home, so he went out in the meadow and behind, and he hid somewhere in the bushes, and that was pretty scary. And then, towards the end of the war, we had to have Germans quartered in with us, because we had a farm, and we had a hayloft, and so there were places that they could stay. We had stables. But before that happened, I just remember this story. This was funny. The Germans always used to come by. They wanted to requisite chickens and any livestock you had. They were so desperate for food. And somehow they had found out that my family had found out that they were going to have this razzia and take their chickens. So they took all the chickens that they had up to the hayloft and tried to hide them in the hayloft. And they put some chickens over the fence with the neighbors, hoping that that we would have just enough chickens so that the Germans wouldn't take them, and somehow we went off. The chickens in the hayloft didn't start to cackle, and everything went off okay. So it could have been very scary, because if you try to hide something from them, I just don't know what the consequences are. And also one time they went out to buy a pig, and that was rather risque too. And so they put the pig on the back of a bicycle, tied him down, and came home without any problems. And basically, although I say they weren't my parents, they were very good to me. Yeah.
Were they giving you any information about the outside world that you could use to understand what was going on?
Not really. I understood that the Germans were the ones who were the bad guys, and we were sort of the victims. And it was truly a very incomprehensible situation. I did understand, and that was the trauma. That I was always scared. I was always running away from people that I wasn't sure of. And I always had to make sure to be home at a certain time. When I went to school, I wasn't allowed to just meander home. They expected me to be home at a certain time. And I think the only time that I actually got spanked was when I didn't get home on time. I had sort of wandered off, and I got a good spanking because it just couldn't happen. They were just too worried about that. But they gave me as much freedom as they possibly could. Yeah.
Did you know of any other families or children that were being hidden like yourself?
No. I really didn't. Everybody was very discreet about it. Yeah.
Had you heard anything about your family?
No, I never heard about my family until after the war. I know that my family stayed in touch with the underground people, so they knew where, at least they knew where my brother was, and I think they must have known where either my father or mother was. They were hidden separately, so they didn't know from each other whether they were alive or not. And but I know I never heard about them. Never. And I really, I remember not really asking very much because I knew it was useless. Nobody could answer. So.
Was this the third family you were with, the final family through the end of the war?
Right. And I stayed with them actually later than that. Because what happened was, of course, with my parents having gone in hiding, first of all, I think everything that we had was stolen. And of course the house that we lived in was taken by other people. And so after the war, what happened was that we had no place to live. So I stayed on with this family, and then 6 months later my father died. And that was a whole different situation.
How did he die?
He died of a heart attack. He had, angina. And so finally, my mother lived actually in in her office. Somehow they had managed to secure their office space, or maybe they had got a new office space. I don't know. And but when the war ended, actually, we had no home. So for another year, my brother and I together were farmed out again to a cousin of my mother's, who I didn't know at all. So
do you know specifically when you were reunited with your brother?
I really don't remember, but I know that it must have been sometime before the school year started again, because he and I, it may have been in the summer.
And what was that like to be reunited with him?
It was strange, because he had changed a lot. His experience had been very traumatic. He had been with people where they had children his age, and he really didn't have enough food, and he wasn't given much attention. And so my mother always said he really had changed. He was a nervous wreck. He was so nervous, and so very confused. Yeah, he didn't fare as well as I did. No.
Did you share with each other what your experiences were?
No. It was just like, okay, great, we're back together. This is wonderful. Yeah.
Great. What happened next?
Well, what happened next was the post-war. It's really interesting. People always think that when the war is over, it's over, But then, okay, it's over, fine, and you don't have to be scared again. You can be yourself again. But you have to pull your life together again. So here my father has just died. We have no home. We lost everything. My brother and I are farmed out again to strangers, where we lived for at least a year.
Where were your two half-brothers by now?
One of them had actually managed to escape to England, and he became a flyer for the RAF. That was the youngest. And my older half-brother had escaped to Switzerland, and there he had been, I think, most of the time in a sanatorium because he ended up with tuberculosis. So they both survived. My grandparents didn't, and two of my mother's sisters and their entire families didn't.
Do you know how they died?
Yeah, they were all taken to a concentration camp. My two cousins were taken to the gas chamber. Yeah. And my mother was very upset with the... there was a Jewish commission. I don't know what you would call that. And she had, begged them to find a place for my grandparents. And they sort of sent her packing. They didn't want to hear about it because they were busy with somebody else. So they couldn't help my grandparents, so they were old. So they were taken to the gas chamber. The story of one of my aunts is very interesting and also very sad, of course. Her husband had been captured and taken to one of the pre-transportation camps. And my aunt and her two children, a boy and a girl, were going to visit him.
What were all of their names?
My aunt, I don't remember my aunt's name. I know my female cousin's name was Lucia, but I don't remember my other cousin's name, nor my uncle. And the whole family said to her, "Don't go, you won't come back." And she just wouldn't listen. So she went with the children, and she didn't come back. So it's very sad. Yeah. So I lost about 50% of my immediate family. But my parents both came back. So to come back on what happened after the war, so here we are, finally after 1 year with my mother's cousin. We got a house in, now it's a suburb of Amsterdam, but at the time it wasn't. It's called Amstelveen.
Now, was your mother still living at this time?
Yeah, she was. My mother raised us. She actually passed away in 1988, so she survived my father by quite a few years. And so we got a house in Amstelveen, very nice house. And my mother tried to continue my father's business. But in 45, 50, I think in about 1949 or 1950, the business folded. So she never really got it back to where it was. It was very, very hard. And we went through a very rough period. We had no money. She had to find a job. She was trying to raise us all by herself. And we moved from one place to another, and finally, I don't know how many times we moved, but finally we settled in the southern part of Amsterdam when I was about 15 years old, and I was able to finish my high school, and then I started working at 18. But that was very unsettling.
Okay. I'm curious as to why you were separated from your mother and lived with your cousin if she was still alive for that period of time.
Because we didn't have a house. And so, we had lost everything, and all my mother had was her office, her one office thing. So she slept in the office, actually, but there were no accommodations for us. So my mother's cousin lived in Haarlem, which is a city to the west of Amsterdam. And that's where we were.
You're
for
still
a
able
year.
to maintain close contact. And,
With my mother's
Your mother.
cousin? No, I don't even know if she's alive or not.
no, at the time with your mother, though, you were still in close contact.
Oh yeah, my mother visited us every weekend. The one thing that my mother did though, and I can't blame her. She, after we got back with her, I wanted to write to my family, and she said she'd lost the address. She just wanted to put a line under the whole experience, and she never allowed me or my brother to have contact with our foster parents. And I wish she had, but I can understand it. And the other thing, which is actually a little bit funny, I said to her that I wanted to become a Catholic because I just loved faith, and I had never had any. And when I was with the family, it was the first time I had been exposed to it. And she said to me, well, if you can find yourself a Catholic church and go to a priest, you can become a Catholic. And of course she knew full well that there weren't any churches in the vicinity for miles. So I never became a Catholic.
Was any religion a part of your life?
No. As a matter of fact, my mother was very anti-religion. And what's happened finally, when we settled down in the south of Amsterdam, by that time we were about 11, 12 years old. My mother always said to us, never tell anybody that you're a Jew, because this is going to happen again. And the other thing that she did was she sent us to non-denominational schools where there was, no religious upbringing. Everybody was from a different faith or no faith at all. And then one day we received a letter from, I think it was the head rabbi in Amsterdam. And one of my mother's neighbors found it. We lived in an apartment. So she comes to my mother. She says, oh, I didn't know you were Jewish. And my mother lost it.
How so?
She just didn't want to be Jewish. She didn't want anybody to know that we were Jewish. And she just didn't want to have anything to do with Jews because of what happened to my grandparents. All her life, she was very bitter about that. So she made my brother and myself write a letter to the rabbi saying that we never wanted to hear from him again and that we never wanted to be a part of the Jewish community and so on and so forth. And had I known what I was doing, I would probably not have written the letter. But you're 11, 12 years old and you don't know. So she actually didn't want us to be part of our heritage. And like I say, I can't hold it against her. I understand.
Did she share with you any of her experiences at the time?
She shared very little. But she told me where she had been hidden. She had been hidden with the family of the best known resistance fighter in Holland. Gerrit van der Veen is his name. And his sister and her husband took care of my mother. And her experiences I don't think were very good, but they weren't very bad either. My father, I never knew what happened to him. But she wasn't, she didn't talk about it. She didn't want to talk about it.
What did she do after the war?
What she did, like I say, she tried to continue my father's business, which was difficult. And my oldest half-brother it was my father's wish that after he died, and he didn't know when that would happen, of course, but it had been his wish, which he had told her, that he wanted my brother to be a partner in the business. And I don't think he was a very responsible man. So my mother always said that because of him the business went bad, and so but it's easy to blame somebody, you just don't know. So that's how she lost the business. He made a few bad decisions. And then, of course, we lost everything, and she no longer had a business for herself. So she became a secretary in what was it already? A printing company. They printed calendars and cards. And I think she stayed there for most of, for let me see when that happened. Excuse me. That happened like maybe around 1949, 1950. And she left the company in... when was it? I think in 1965 or 1966. So she was there for 15, 16 years. Yeah. And that's what she did. She was a secretary.
What point in time would you consider liberation to have occurred?
For me?
For you, right? I mean, in terms of as a child, when you met with your brother, or...
I know that I think for me liberation occurred when I immigrated. When I came to the United States, that was it. I was like Europe to me is heavy. There's just I don't like it. If anybody would ask me if I would want to go back to live in Europe, anywhere in Europe, I would say no. I was looking at some school pictures, taken when I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and I always have to laugh because the angriest and the grumpiest looking kids are my brother and myself. People recognize now that after all these experiences, you need therapy. And especially children, it needs to be explained to them what they have gone through, why they have gone through it, what has happened to them. And for us, that was never done. We were alive, and be glad that was the option of it.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. I understand we have a picture you'd like to show us of you and your brother?
Uh-huh.
Okay, we're ready if you'd like to use the pointer and identify them for us.
Sure. This, of course, is my brother. It looks like a boy. And this is myself. This picture was taken, I think, just before the war. And this picture was given to the families that my family at least, that I stayed in hiding with. And I haven't mentioned this, I think, or maybe I have. We had this reunion in 1989 to honor our foster parents and our rescuers. And my last family gave that picture back to me. That's when I got it back.
Okay, that's wonderful. We'll wait a moment for these.
Okay.
So... Okay, we'll start with this picture first.
That picture was taken in 1945 after we had been liberated by I think it was a combined force of Americans and English. And these were taken by the Americans. This is in the orchard. I think it was, the trees, I think, still look a little bit bare. I think it may have been spring. I think it was spring. So... that was taken by the American soldiers.
What were you thinking at the time? Do you remember?
No. Actually, I haven't mentioned our liberation. That was very exciting. We even our neighbors who never came to our shelter, they had come into our shelter because the fighting was so heavy. And my people were truly good human beings, because the Germans were literally on the run. I mean, they were running for the border. And they were knocking on our door. And the women, they gave them bread. You know, we had some bread left, and they gave it to them. They didn't say, go away, we have nothing. They were wonderful people. And we couldn't get out of the shelter for 3 days. I mean, it was fighting, and I wasn't even allowed outside the house and into the fields because there was blood all over the place, and it was bad. One of the women tried to rescue our cow, but she couldn't get through. I mean, the bullets were just flying around. It was a miracle that she didn't get hit. And the cow stayed alive. She went somewhere to the back of the meadow, and she stayed alive. And then the Germans were gone, and then the Americans came. And, you know, rumors were flying. I mean, and everybody was lining the streets, and it was just, oh yeah, the Americans were coming. Well, we had a very narrow road, and it curved up like this, and they were coming down this way. Our house was here, and it really narrowed in the curve, and there was a hill. And a guy who lived on the corner, he had a greengrocer store. And finally, you know, we got the word, yes, the tanks are coming. And so the tanks were coming down, but the street was so narrow, they had to veer past his house and then make the corner, because, you know, these things are not very agile. You don't move them that easily. Well, this poor guy, nothing had happened to his house during the war. But the tanks, a couple of them just crashed into his wall because they misjudged the corner. So he took his hay fork and he was trying to attack the tanks. He got so upset. Oh, poor guy. But it was very, very exciting. I remember I got stung by a bee on my ear, and I never even said anything. I was just so excited that these people were finally coming. And, you know, here we were free. That was it. Everybody was excited. That was wonderful.
Perhaps we can look at the last picture.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to digress. These are the 4 ladies who, the young women who took care of me. And I have the names written on the back, so I really I don't know in which order they are, but I know one of them is Jeanette and Lieke and Tony, and there's another name, Maria. Maria was the teacher, and Tony was she was a nurse. So those 2 weren't home all the time, but Lieke and Jeanette were the 2 who took care of me.
And from which family were they?
They were the Sohns family.
It's nice that you were able to have a few pictures. How did you come by them?
That picture was also given to me in 1989 when I visited Holland. That picture I had with me ever since it was taken.
Okay. What we're showing here is I've turned over the picture of the 4 ladies. If you'd like to mention their names once more.
The names are Lieke, Tonia, Jeanette, and Maria.
Okay, thank you. Okay. And the picture of you and your brother, you said, was...
That was also given to me in 1989 when I finally reunited with part of my family. It was one of the boys and his wife. And they were wonderful, beautiful people. And so was my first family. When I went to Amsterdam, I was met by my first family, my first foster mother, who is still alive in her 80s at the airport, her and her family. And I met my supposed cousin again. And she herself now has, I think she has 3 children and 4 grandchildren. And her mother, my foster mother, lives with her. And she's doing okay, but she has problems with old age, being in her 80s.
We're getting very close to the end of the first tape.
Uh-huh.
So perhaps this would be a good opportunity to take a break
Okay.
before we start the next one.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Mistake. This is the continuation of the Marietta Den Berg testimony. When we stopped to change the tape, we spoke of liberation and what that was like for you. I'd like to know more specifically when you were reunited with your mom after living with your cousins, and then when you were liberated by the Allied forces.
Okay. Actually, I lived south of the Rhine River. So I was already liberated in, I believe, September 1944 by the English and American allies. My parents and my brother lived north of the river, so they went through what we call the hunger winter of 44-45, and they were not freed until May 5th. And that was just 5 days before my 8th birthday. Then my parents, we had to find each other, and the Red Cross coordinated a lot of things, and I think we found each other, all of us, through the Red Cross. I'm not sure how much the resistance people stayed in contact with my parents after they went into hiding. I have no idea. Anyway, so I stayed on the farm, and my brother actually joined me there while my parents looked for living space, because between the two of them they just had the office. And then, of course, my father passed away. And that was actually very sad, because I only saw him once before he passed away. He had come south. And when you're so young, you forget very easily. So here is this gentleman who shows up, and they tell me he's my father, and I didn't recognize him. And it was just like, oh, I guess so, but I'm not sure. Oh, I think I can get used to this person again. But anyway, he spent just a day with me. And then a couple of weeks later, he passed away. And of course, like I say, that was pretty sad, and the more difficult and traumatic for my mother, because all of a sudden she lost her support system and had to fend for herself. So my brother joined me on with the family zones on the farm. I've always considered it a farm, but it really isn't. And he stayed until my mother was ready to take us back, and actually at the time she really wasn't, but she asked them if my brother could. They wanted to keep me, and she asked him if my brother could stay as well, but you know, he was so, he was a real problem. I mean, he was just totally wild and unmanageable and you know, traumatized, and they just couldn't handle him, so they said yes, they would keep me, but no, they didn't want to keep my brother. So then my mother had to make the decision to take us both back, but have us live with her cousin. And they had one son, and he was a teenager. He was in high school. He was a rather strange guy, but we got along well. Not with the mother. She was very strict. She didn't really know much about children. That's one thing I remember that was so funny. Actually, it wasn't funny, but you know, looking back at it, I think it's funny. I had to have my tonsils out, and when I came back from the hospital, I'd been in the hospital for 1 whole week, just having my tonsils out, but they were scared of complications. I screamed the whole hospital together. I had a terrible nightmare. And I said, I am Maria. Maria was my name, my abbreviated name. You know, and I just screamed and screamed and screamed. And it was just like a reaction, because what I had dreamt was that a rooster had eaten me, and I had no identity whatsoever. And I know that it was just like everything that was just, down there just surfaced. And they couldn't stop me crying. I think I cried for hours. Anyway, and that was after the operation, when I came out of the anesthesia. So that was pretty traumatic and dramatic. Anyway, so we had to go back to that family, and I had to have a raw egg every day. I tell you, I mean, and this woman, she just gave me the raw egg to eat, with nothing in it, no sugar, nothing else. It was just horrible. I tried to hide everywhere I could in that house. It was just awful. Anyway, that was my very small part of my experience. And after that, my mother finally found a house. I think that must have been either in 1946 or 47. And I think I told you already, we lived in that house for, I don't know how long we lived there, a couple of years. I went to a non-denominational school then. And then after a while, we moved to Amsterdam. And that's when, things started to go not so well, and she finally lost the business. And I continued. I went to quite a few schools. There was no stability there either. I had gone first grade. I was in Limburg, in Merkelbeek in school. Second grade, I was in Aardenhout, which was a city near Haarlem, where I was staying with my mother's cousin. Then third and fourth grade, I was in Amstelveen. Fifth grade, I went to a boarding school because things weren't going so well, and my mother just didn't want us around, so boarding school it was. And I went to Baarn, to a school. That was just 1 year. And in my sixth grade, I went back to Amstelveen. So, I was moved around. And then we have sixth grade, and then you go to high school. I went to high school until I was 18. I didn't really finish it because I had to double up on one of my classes, and I said, forget it. Don't want to do this. So, and actually in high school, funny enough, I came across the philosophy of reincarnation. And that just sort of opened the door for me. And we didn't follow the Jewish religion because my mother had made us write this letter. So, but my high school was a Reformed Dutch high school. And like I say, I was there till I was 18. And then I started to work. I worked for a import-export company of books. And until about, that was 1958. I worked there from 1956 to 1958. And 1958, I went to England as a maid, which was quite an experience. I was there till, was it 58 or 59? I think it was 59, February 59. And I was there for about 9 months. Then I came back. And then in 1960, no, it was 58, 59, 60, I went to France.
You mentioned earlier that one of your half-brothers was in England at one time?
Yeah.
Was he still there, or had they come back? Did you see them?
They had moved out. So as a matter of fact, the last time I saw my oldest half-brother was when I was 12 years old. And I have really not been in contact with them at all.
With either half-brother?
No. They didn't stay in contact with us, and we didn't stay in contact with them. I don't think there was a lot of love lost between them and my mother, unfortunately. And we were too young, we weren't even of their generation. So, anyway.
How did you get the funds to go to England?
I was working, so I saved money. Yeah, I started working when I was 18, and I went to England when I was 20. So, and I celebrated my 21st year in England. It was a lot of fun. So I went to this place in Maidenhead called Schopenhauer's Manor, And it was a very interesting experience. It was a bit wild, but it was very interesting. And then I went back to Holland for just a couple of months, and I worked, and then I decided to go to France, to Paris, where I worked also au pair in a family. I tried to study. At the time, I was sort of thinking of studying languages and becoming a teacher. And I went to the Alliance Française and didn't care for it. So I was there for about 14 months. Then I came back to Holland and back to my family. I said, well, what am I going to do with myself? Okay, I'll work. So I worked.
Had things changed over time each time you came back? I mean, post-war, were there a lot of changes occurring?
Yes and no. You know, things, for us, things didn't really get all that much better. I mean, okay, we had a place to live. We moved around. We had finally settled into a house when I was about 15 years old. This house, this apartment was built after the First World War as a temporary lodging. And of course, nobody ever broke it down, and they remained. There was a whole row of houses, you know, it became a street. There was no hot water, there was only cold water. There was like a living room, and there were two large rooms which you could consider a living room and a dining room, and then there were two very small bedrooms. So both my brother and I had each one little bedroom, and then my mother slept in the dining room. And what can you say? And we had to install a little gas heater above the kitchen sink because that was the only source for our hot water. And you know, my mother had to pay for our tuition, and it was quite a struggle, a real struggle. And there was never any money, never. We went from, so to speak, riches to rags. And it was difficult, really, really difficult. But we survived. But I always had this, I always felt depressed. I was never really, really happy. You know, there was always, things were just not right for me. Never. Never. Anyway, so we were in this apartment since I was about 15 years old. And so I studied, I worked, I went to England, I went to France. And I had a choice of going either to the Alliance Française or the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne might have been better, but I went to the Alliance Française, but you know, that's neither here nor there. So I came back and moved back in with my mother. And then finally, what happened in 1960 was my girlfriend moved to the United States. She had gotten married. Her husband is from Indonesia. And he had worked, he's quite a bit older than she is, and he had been a soldier in the Dutch army in Indonesia, and he worked on the Burma Railroad. Yeah, right, prisoner of war. So they met in Holland and they immigrated, and you know, we kept in contact. And I was never happy in Holland. I can honestly say that. I mean, yeah, there were very funny moments and nice moments, but, you know, like a real happiness, no. So, anyway, we kept corresponding, and I finally, you know, they kept saying, well, why don't you come here? You know, you'll have no problem. You speak the language, you know, you can find a job. Come. So finally, in 1963, I made up my mind to immigrate, so I asked for my papers. I got my papers in 6 weeks because my girlfriend and her husband, they knew the secretary of I think it is the World Church Organization, and they managed to get me in on a refugee quota. So, you know, things are always as they have to be. But I didn't leave Europe until 1964. And I have to say, life has been good ever since.
How did you adjust to life in America?
Very easily. I speak the language. I spoke and I speak it. And I found a job after I was here 3 weeks as a switchboard operator. And I worked for the airlines, various airlines, for about 22 years. And that was from 1964 to 1986. And in 1986, I quit. In 1983, I started to live in a religious community. And in 1986, I started to live there full time. I quit my job and so on and so forth. And I've lived there ever since.
So does Judaism play a role in your life at all?
No, unfortunately not. And I say unfortunately because there is part of me that regrets it. But I have chosen a totally different path. And I have to say I absolutely don't miss it. So, my regret is this small. And maybe one of these days I'll have the opportunity to study it and to read about it. I do have that because we have a wonderful library and we have tons of books on the Judaic teachings. So but my life is very full and I am happy.
And what type of work do you do, or occupation?
My occupation is monastic. I'm actually a sister in the order that we have. It's the Vedic teachings. It's called Vedanta. You can consider it a religion. You can consider it a philosophy. And the basic tenet actually is the same as in Judaism, because Isaiah says that the Lord our God is one. In our main philosophy, the Rig Veda, it says God is one without a second. So the two are very, very close. And in our philosophy, actually, we honor and respect all religions. We are considered non-denominational and non-sectarian. And if you would ever have the opportunity to see our temple, we have niches dedicated to all the major religions, Christianity. We are going to be, this is the 9th of April, Palm Sunday. Next week we're going to be celebrating Holy Week. We'll observe Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, Easter sunrise service, Easter Sunday. We pay respect to all religions.
I'd like to sort of change directions a little bit. I thought of a
Sure.
question about something previous, and it was during liberation time. You mentioned the Red Cross had assisted you in reconnecting with your mom and your brother. Do you know how they did that? What information they had about who you were or where they were and how they were able to coordinate that?
No, I really don't. I went once through some papers that I was not supposed to go through, and from my mother, and I saw this little card, which first of all advised her that we had been located, and that came from the Red Cross, and also I think about the fact that my grandparents had not survived. So yeah, but I don't know really how the contact was maintained. Our group, though, very interestingly, is one of the few where they actually kept a record of the children, the names. If the Germans had found that, it would have been curtains for all of us. But at the what do you call that? The municipality. They had a book with all the names of all the children that were taken care of by this group. And my name was, of course, there. So, yeah. And I think that may have been how they found us. I'm not sure. I'm absolutely not sure.
Great. Would you mind giving me the name of the group again?
It is they call themselves the group NV. capital V capital, which is like the group incorporated, no name.
Thanks.
And they were wonderful people. I'm still in contact with the lady whose husband was the one, I think, who transported me. He actually, what happened to him is, that was very sad. He got caught by the Germans, and he was tortured to death because they wanted to know the names of the children who, they were taking care of. And he never said a word. Never.
Do you know their names?
Sammy Riekerk and Joop Wortman. Sammy has been working real hard for this. He got a place named after him, a street in Amsterdam, in one of the newer parts in Amsterdam. And the latest correspondence, I correspond with her, and she wrote me. She says, "There's finally, I can put a line under this. It's done, it's over with, and that's it."
Great. Do you have any additional comments that you'd like to add at this point?
No, unless you have any questions that you can think of.
No, I think that we've covered quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just like to provide the opportunity for any final comments or thoughts you might have for anyone that might view this in the future and try to understand what happened.
Well, I think it's, first of all, what I feel is that if it is something, even if you hear about it, you can never imagine how it is. Never. If you don't experience it yourself, there's just no imagining. And it's, of course, with me, it wasn't so much it was the emotional trauma. Not, physically I was fine, as I've said. The not understanding, the not being able to put things together. And although I would hope that people will learn from it, I also know human nature. But maybe it will help people to understand that violence and annihilating each other is not the way to go. It's just not.
Great. I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
This concludes our interview. On behalf of the Holocaust Oral History Project of the Orange County Anti-Defamation League, again, thank you very much. We sincerely appreciate your time and effort. Thank you. Shalom.
Shalom.